Marshal Luke Hill was taking his ease in a chair tilted against the two-room adobe which served as office and jail. There was another chair. Young Larry Wander could have occupied it. But Larry wasn't doing much sitting these days. He had horse ranch worries, and his idea of relaxation was to stand and fidget. "I got a week," Larry declared grimly. "A week, that's all, to scare up the money, or else the Pine Grove Bank goes into the horse ranch business and I go on the bum." From under grizzled brows the marshal regarded the Barkay rancher with real affection. "Leave an old-timer give you some advice, Larry," he said earnestly. "Stop worrying." From down the street sounded the jangle of chain traces as the Pine Grove stage pulled away from the depot platform. As the four-horse team hooved past the jail, the driver reined in and from his high seat waved a greeting. "Hey, Luke." "Hi, Larry." Larry nodded, and the marshal called back, "Peaceful Paul, you old sinner." The veteran driver grinned, and reached for his plug tobacco. The plug was shredded on the biting edge, because Peaceful Paul didn't have many teeth, and those he did have didn't hit very well. But he worried himself off a chew and chuckled. "Well, I'm waiting. Ain't you going to heave me up some of your double-distilled advice, Luke?" "Yeah, you old tobacco-faced sinner," the marshal growled, "I'll give you some advice. Start worrying." Peaceful Paul chuckled. "I'll take it under advisement." He gathered in the reins, bawled profanely at his lead team, and got going. "You dish it out plumb indiscriminate," Larry commented. "You tell Peaceful to start worrying and me to stop." "Correct. If you two would split half and half on that you'd both be about perfect." "What's Peaceful supposed to start worrying about?" "You know how he is. Been wheeling out other people's gold from the Yellow Fork diggings for so long he handles it like it was sacks of frijoles." "You want him to start riding a shotgun guard?" "Correct. He's been 20 years on this run and never a holdup," Larry reminded. "All the more reason for him to start carrying a guard. He's been long time crowding his luck." "Peaceful Paul, why, he's friends to everybody and thinks everybody's his friend. Anyway, he's always armed." "You don't know the half of it. That old hog leg he carries in the boot pocket, it ain't been loaded since he started the Yellow Fork runs." Larry shrugged. "He'll probably live to an uneventful old age, while me, living the life of a safe and sane ex-horse ranch owner. I'll probably die soon and violent." The marshal gave a mild snort. "There you go, just like your old pappy. Best friend I ever had, but in the 40 years I've known him, he never stopped worrying. You ain't an ex-ranch owner for another week yet." From inside the barred window of the cell at their backs there sounded a scuffing on the punch-in floor. "You got a jailhouse customer?" Larry asked in surprise. The marshal lowered his voice. "This ain't a customer. It's an old buzzard they call Scalp Jackson. He come hazing in one day, and I leave him sleep in the jail. He sweeps out for me and such. Reckon you might call him Pine Grove's unofficial jailer." The marshal felt his pockets. "Seeing Peaceful comb that plug of his through his teeth has sharpened my own tobacco hunger." He raised his voice. "Hey, Scalp, got a chew on you?" From inside the cell a face pressed close to the window bars. It was a face buried to the eyes in wiry grizzled hair. The eyes looked out, little and bright. The lips parted to utter one guttural word. "Catch." He dropped a well-gnawed plug of tobacco through the window. The marshal caught it, bit off a chew, and offered the plug to Larry. The young rancher shook his head. "That's right, you don't use it, do you?" The marshal passed the plug back. A grimy hand with long fingernails reached through the bars and enveloped it. "Thanks, Scalp," said the marshal. Scalp Jackson grunted and moved back out of the sunlight which streamed through the window. "Sociable critter, ain't he?" Larry remarked. "Scalp's all right. Little bushed, that's all, from living alone so much. Thrown his blanket with Indians some. This old hooscow reminds him of a cave, I reckon. That's why he likes it. Be living in a cave myself, the ways things are shaping up for the Barkay." Larry grinned, trying to put up a front. But the grin couldn't blank out the haunting despair from his eyes, nor tone out the bitterness from his voice. The Barkay meant so much to him, and he had tried so damnably hard to hold it. Carved out of buffalo grazing grounds by his father and stocked originally with native mustangs, the ranch had been developed until now the Barkay brand meant something very special to anyone who appreciated good horses. But Larry had been tagged by bad luck for 3 seasons running, the kind of luck that no man who lives off the land can avoid, luck determined by wrong combinations of wind and sun and water. And now the Pine Grove Bank was substantially interested in the ranch. Next week, barring a miracle, It would take over. "How much money could you get by son?" the marshal asked. "If I could put up $2,000, I could get an extension on the loan." "2,000 ain't much. It is if you ain't got it. You tried over Gravel Shoals way? Your pappy had a heap of friends thereabouts." Larry nodded somberly. "I'm heading out for there now. Figuring to stay out all week and brace every friend the Bar K ever had. But they been bad hit, too. Ain't likely they'll have money to lend." Marshal Hill sighed. "Just you try not to worry, son." He meant well, but he knew he was talking through his hat. It was a chore for him to meet Larry's worried eyes. "You've put up a good fight," he muttered. "Done all any man could do. So keep a tight rein. Lots can happen in a week." Lots did. The fireworks started 3 days later with the Pine Grove stage. Peaceful Paul was wheeling along through Rio Toro Canyon when he came to a place where 2 huge boulders clogged the trail. Their presence aroused no suspicion in the old driver's mind. There had been a rain. The boulders could have become dislodged and rolled down the slope. Peaceful Paul brought his 4-horse team to a stop, grumbling a little at the prospect of having to climb down and roll the boulders aside. To fortify himself for the task, he pulled out his chewing tobacco. Sinking his scattered teeth in the plug, he shook his head like a terrier worrying a rat. By the time he looked up, a man on horseback had left the concealment of a trailside thicket, and ridden close. The man was dressed in a swaddling oilskin slicker. Small glittering eyes looked out of a slit formed by his sombrero brim above, and a red bandana that covered his face below. In his hand he held a 6-shooter. Peaceful Paul was so startled that he swallowed the chew of tobacco he had laboriously bitten off. He started swearing. "That's going to give me a stomachache," he complained. "No it won't," the gunman told him. "It always does," Peaceful Paul argued. "This time is different." Peaceful Paul didn't read any sinister implication into the words. In the face of the close sporting 6-gun, he just waited, still gripping in one hand the ragged-edged plug of tobacco and holding his other hand where the gunman could see that it was empty. "The gold," the bandit reminded. "In the stage boot, here by my feet." "Hand it over." Peaceful Paul bent, and came up with a single action .45. His move was so entirely unexpected that he succeeded in lining the long-barreled gun on the bandit. His hand was steady. So was his voice. "Makes it a standoff," he said. "Can't either one of us shoot without jarring a bullet from the other. Start backing away, stranger, and maybe so both of us can keep living." The gunman laughed shortly and kneed his horse in closer. He reached out with his own gun and clubbed the single action from Peaceful Paul's hand. "The gold," the bandit grated. This time Peaceful Paul handed it over. There was nothing else to do. It was a good haul, some $30,000 in the peculiarly twisted nuggets from the Yellow Fork diggings. And in addition to the heavy pokes, a shipment of $4,000 in gold coin from the Pine Grove Bank. The bandit stowed it all in his saddlebags. Peaceful Paul, with misery in his eyes, watched. All this gold, other people's gold that they had worked for and built dreams around, was lost to them now, stolen. He couldn't expect any help from his passengers, 2 women, a little boy, and a timid leather goods drummer from Pittsburgh. No, the gold was gone. He should have been riding a shotgun guard the way Luke Hill had wanted him to. Then probably no one would have been tough enough to try a stick-up. What happened next was the occasion for some disagreement among the passengers. Not in principle. In detail merely. There was a shot. A single close-up blast that sent gun echoes crashing through the canyon and that made a lifeless hulk of old Peaceful Paul. He took the bullet through the heart and slumped down there on the driver's seat. The terrified passengers were crowding the stage windows. They saw the gunman lean out of saddle briefly to bend over the driver's limp body. Then the bandit reared his horse around and rode down canyon. So the way it turned out, Peaceful Paul needn't have worried about that chew of tobacco he had swallowed. It didn't give him the stomachache, after all. In reciting the experience afterward to Marshal Luke Hill in Pine Grove, what the passengers disagreed about was the bandit's reason for killing Peaceful Paul. The women insisted he had shot callously, deliberately, in cold blood. The leather goods drummer from Pittsburgh thought he might have become trigger jitter there at the last and fired without meaning to. But by and large, the citizenry of Pine Grove spent little time in speculating on the killer's impulses. A man they had long known and loved had been cruelly, needlessly killed. Peaceful Paul, who had had no malice in his heart for any man on earth, had been blasted from earth by a murderer's bullet. And with his death, anger had grown in the hearts of Pine Grove men, anger toward his killer. They murmured restlessly at the end of the second day when Marshal Luke Hill admitted he was no nearer to a solution of the crime. On the third day, with no new developments, they didn't murmur, they muttered, and talked openly of vigilante committees and lynchings. Early on the morning of the fourth day after the murder, Larry Wonder was waiting at the bank door when Elijah Peppermill came to open up. Elijah Peppermill was a good banker. Neither the killing of Peaceful Paul nor the loss of the bank's gold upset him to the point where they dampened his interest in the daily accounts receivable. "Morning," the banker greeted Larry crisply. "Reckon as how you've come to take care of that note." Elijah Peppermill didn't reckon anything of the sort. He knew Larry was broke. That the young man's presence here on the last day of grace could mean only, as Larry himself had expressed it, that the Pine Grove Bank was going into the horse ranch business and Larry was going on the bum. That was why the banker's thin lips tightened in amazed unbelief, and his eyebrows crawled up a lull half-inch on his high-smooth forehead. Larry nodded and said, "That's right, Mr. Peppermill. I've got the money with me." Larry moved toward his horse, hitched at the bank rack, and hefted a sack from his saddlebag. Inside the bank, Elijah Peppermill emptied the sack and there, behind his grilled window, counted out $2,000 in gold coin. "Looks like that saves your neck," he said grudgingly. He looked thoughtful. "Then again," he said, squeezing the words from between pursed lips, "maybe it don't." "What you mean by that?" Larry demanded. Elijah Peppermill answered with a question of his own. "Where you been all week?" "Over Gravel Shoals way." "Doing what?" "Riding the hoofs off my horse trying to find somebody to loan me the 2,000. "Who'd you borrow it from?" "I don't know." "You don't know?" "Not for sure." Elijah Peppermill's suspicion wasn't very thinly veiled now. "What do you know for sure?" Larry shrugged. "I just rode in last night. News don't percolate very fast in the Gravel Shoals country." "Something happened?" Elijah Peppermill told him what had happened. A little later, as he was leaving the bank, Larry bumped into Marshal Luke Hill. This last week the Marshal's thoughts had been so focused on the Rio Toro crime that he had given little consideration to the plight of Larry Wander. Seeing Larry now, the Marshal stopped, and his heart went out in quick sympathy. "Tough break, son. But you put up a good fight. That's the main thing." "Yeah," Larry said uncertainly. "Yeah. What you aiming to do now?" "Why, same like always. I mean, now that you've lost your ranch." "I haven't lost it," Larry cut in. "Not yet." "Elijah give you an extension?" "Yeah." The Marshal stared oddly. "But you needed 2,000 for that." "I got it," Larry said tightly. He returned the peace officer's shrewd gaze as long as he could, then his face flamed angrily. "You going to be like old Peppermill? He didn't exactly accuse me of anything, but he looked aplenty. I know what he was thinking." "What was he thinking, son?" "That my 2,000 was dead man money, robbed from the Pine Grove stage." "Where did you get it?" "It ain't anybody's business, is it?" Marshal Hill looked aggrieved. "Just asking, son. Not curious like, but as a friend." "All right, as a friend I'll tell you," Larry said defiantly. "Somebody left it on my doorstep." "Is that a friendly answer?" the Marshal chided. "You asked for it." "I'm still asking. And I'm still telling you. I came dragging back last night from Gravel Shoals empty-handed. And I found $2,000 in gold coin on my doorstep. No note with it. I don't know where it came from, haven't had time yet to go inquiring." "Maybe you've made some guesses, though?" "Could be damn near anybody," Larry asserted. "Dad had friends all over this country. More than one of them, I reckon, felt enough indebted to him to have left that money." "With no note to show where it came from?" the Marshal said skeptically. "Floored me, too, at first. Then I got to thinking. If somebody wanted to make me a gift for Dad's sake, they'd have to do it this way, wouldn't they? If I knew who left it I'd insist on paying them back." The Marshal didn't say anything. "You don't believe me, do you?" Bitterness crowded Larry's voice. "You're the oldest friend I've got. If I can't tell you the truth and get believed, I can't tell anybody." The Marshal nodded gravely. "Still talking as a friend, leave me give you some advice, don't tell anybody. Like you say, they wouldn't believe you." Larry fooled around for a while in town, bought some supplies, somberly listened to the lynch talk in the barber shop where he got a haircut, and listened to more of it over a couple of beers in Whiskey Jack's saloon. He drove back to the Barquet in a buckboard. When he got there he found a visitor sitting on his porch. The visitor was Marshal Luke Hill. The Marshal came right to the point. I took it upon myself to meddle around here a bit, Larry. I found this." He held up a nondescript canvas bag. Larry bristled. "So what? Suppose you tell me." "It's the bag the gold was in." "The gold you claim was left on your front steps?" "That's right," Larry flared. "And it ain't one of the bank bags, if that's what you're thinking. Just an ordinary old canvas bag that anybody could have." "Correct." The marshal's face hardened. "But the bag I found in your tool shed wasn't an ordinary bag. Take a look. Maybe you can explain it." The marshal reached inside the door, produced a money sack with the name of the Pine Grove Bank woven in the fabric. He turned the bag upside down and shook it. A bit of bright yellow dust sifted out and a few tiny nuggets struck the porch floor. When Larry examined the nuggets and, minute as they were, identified them by their peculiarly twisted shape. "Yellow for gold," the marshal said grimly. Larry looked up. The marshal was covering him with drawn six-gun. "I'm having to arrest you, son," he announced. "For the robbery of the Pine Grove stage and the murder of Peaceful Paul." The blood drained from Larry's face. You're locoed," he blurted finally. "Even if it looks bad for me about the gold, you know me, you know I'd never gun down Peaceful Paul." "You're not a born killer," the marshal said heavily. "That's right. But one of the passengers on the stage opined the gun might have gone off accidental. Stagecoach robbing being a new line for you, it's easy to see how you could have got trigger jittered." "It's a lie," Larry shouted hoarsely. "The whole thing is made out of nothing." He started forward. "Don't crowd my gun," the sheriff warned harshly. "You're the last man in the world I want to be taking in. But I'm sworn to uphold the law, Larry. All my life I've dealt out justice, fair and impartial as I've seen it. I ain't going to start twisting it now to the advantage of my friends. Anyhow, Peaceful Paul was my friend, too. And mine," Larry cried. "When a man is killed," the marshal said implacably, "all the law asks is who killed him. I myself think that's where the law is wrong. It ought to go more into the whys and wherefore. But the law's the law, and I got to take you in." Back in Pine Grove, the marshal routed out Scalp Jackson, who was dozing on the cell bunk, and installed Larry Wander in the cell instead. The place wasn't any refuge to Larry as it had been to the elemental-minded Scalp. Outraged innocence made the young rancher burn with a consuming fire. He had told the whole truth to the marshal. Yet here he was, guilty before the world. Like a caged grizzly, he raged about the cell, shaking the iron door and gripping the bars in the high window. It didn't do any good, of course. The door rattled, that was all, while the window bars, tight in their wooden frame, and in turn deep buried in the thick, sun-baked adobe wall, defied his most strenuous efforts to loosen them. It was while he tugged at the window bars that he became aware of his truly desperate position. He had thought he faced a trial for his life, sometime in the future. But something happened at the window which showed him that he faced death, not in the future, but now, death unencumbered by a court trial. A stone came whizzing through the window. Then another stone and a third. A flung whiskey bottle broke against the iron bars and showered glass on the cell floor. The news that Peaceful Paul's killer had been jailed was spreading like wildfire. The muttering which had grown from a restless murmur, welled to a roar, the hideous roar of the pack on a blood trail. The mob about the jail grew. The hooting and hollering, punctured by occasional gunshots, beat at Larry with the force of physical blows, foreshadowing the death by violence in store for him if the mob should rush the jail. And what was to keep them from rushing it? Larry listened in vain for the voice of Marshal Luke Hill. He should, by all rights, be exhorting the lynch mob to go home and allow justice to take its legal course. But Larry didn't hear a single pipe out of the marshal. What did it mean? Had the old lawman run out on him? Luke Hill took such a firm position on law enforcement, that, on sheer circumstantial evidence, he had brought a friend to stand trial for his life. Then why wasn't he out there protecting his prisoner from this pack of wolves who wanted to take the law into their own hands? There was only one thing for Larry to conclude. The marshal himself must be implicated in the stage stick-up and murder of Peaceful Paul. And he was framing the crime to Larry. After Larry had been seized and lynched, the mob, having glutted itself with the victim, would disperse. The talk would die down, and the marshal to the end of his days would be left in security with his blood-washed gold. Larry felt a pang of disloyalty at entertaining such thoughts about a lifelong friend. The whole thing was incredible, fantastic. But what else could he believe? Bitterness, in a blinding wave, engulfed him. What had he done to deserve this? But even while he asked it, he knew that it wasn't what a fella deserved, it was what he got. Life had handed him one knockout blow after another. He hadn't laid down, he hadn't stopped fighting. But here he was now, punched into a fix where his former friends howled for his blood. And not one single man to stand up for him. Yes, there was, after all. One man. And he barely an acquaintance. One man. Scalp Jackson. Above the clamor of the mob, Larry could hear Scalp Jackson's guttural voice. "Get back. Get back. I'll let go with this shotgun. You ain't going to take him. I'm the jailer. The marshal put him under my charge, and you ain't going to take him. Get back." A sympathetic identity with the eccentric old man surged through Larry. Deserted by all his friends, and Scalp Jackson, half Indian, half animal, stood stubbornly by him. The clamor at the front of the jail lessened, and for a while Larry had hoped that Scalp with his scattergun had won out. But it was a false hope. Marshal Luke Hill might have been clever enough to talk them down, but Scalp wasn't handy with words. The best he could do was to keep them from entering the door on the other side of the building. That wasn't enough. Larry read a finish to the whole grim business in close immediate sounds at the jail window. Despairingly, he froze back against the window wall. No bullet could reach him there. But it wasn't bullets he had to fear. Not then. The end of a rope whipped in between the bars. A hand reached through and threaded the rope back. Unseen hands tied a slip knot. The rope sawed at the bars as the knot tightened to an outside pull. Larry sprang to the cell window, only to be driven back by a hail of bullets. But he knew what was happening. The other end of this rope was cinched to a saddle horn. A sturdy cutting pony would put on speed. The same technique used in throwing a fractious steer would be applied here. The barred window frame would be yanked from the ancient adobe wall. And then they would have him. At the front of the jail, Scalp Jackson had held the wolf pack at bay, but they would reach him now through the window. The rope was already tightening. The shouting increased to a savage roar. The rope thrummed, quivered as it drew taut. There was an instant when it seemed the force was not going to be enough. Then with a thud and crash the window frame went out. Not only the frame, but below the window a section of the wall wide enough to run a horse through was torn away, and with its tearing came a sudden jarring hush. The shouts and the yammering died as the jail raiders stared in frozen disbelief at something revealed in the gap torn in the adobe wall. Larry, in the jail cell, couldn't see what it was that had riveted their attention. He didn't try to see. It was enough for him that their bloodlust had been momentarily sidetracked. Whatever had stilled their shouts and bulged their eyes was important to Larry only because it gave him a chance for life he hadn't expected. Before the man could recover their wits and rush the newly torn gap in the cell wall, Larry rushed out at them. The crumbling adobe was still spilling forward over the ground as he sprang. But he held his footing and rammed in among them before anyone could shoot. His big fists pounded right and left, clearing a path to the horse rack. Enclosed this way, he knew they would hesitate to shoot for fear of endangering their own crowd. With luck, then, he might be able to reach one of the horses. With more luck, he might get away, though by the time he was in saddle they would be shooting. His chances weren't so good, certainly, but he was up on his feet and fighting. That was something. He never did find out if he could have made it or not. Before he had even fought his way to the hit track, another disturbance at the front of the jail caught his ear. There was a shout in a familiar voice, Marshal Luke Hill's voice. And the roaring of guns, the bark of a six-shooter and the deep-mouthed bellow of a shotgun. Ducking a swung fist, Larry landed a hard body punch, pivoted to avoid a bull rush from another man, and got his feet going in the direction where the marshal was locked in deadly embrace with Scalp Jackson. Even as Larry glimpsed them, he saw the marshal go down under a crushing short-arm blow. Scalp Jackson raised the shotgun to crash it against the marshal's skull. Larry's feet pounded gravel. His big fist started its swing before he was anywhere near, but he came in so fast that his timing on the blow was perfect. He seemed to know instinctively that he was helping the right man when his knuckles sank with a solid thump against Scalp Jackson's hairy jaw. Jackson's feet left the ground and he was 15 feet away, and unconscious, by the time he stopped rolling. The marshal sat up and surveyed the scene with groggy eyes. There was blood matting his hair on one side of his head. Larry noticed that it was dried, black, clotted blood. It had not come from a recent wound. "First off," he announced a bit shakily, "Larry ain't the one. It was Scalp Jackson killed Peaceful Paul." It took a moment for the words to sink in. Then there was a collective growl from the masked men and a rushing movement toward Scalp Jackson, where he lay in a tangled heap on the ground. "Save your strength," the marshal advised caustically. "I killed him myself. My 6-gun got him when I swapped for his shotgun lead. He was dead on his feet when Larry clipped him. But I'd have been dead, too, if Larry hadn't come in when he did." "Goes double, partner," said Larry. "They had my goose about cooked when you showed up. Where the hell you been?" "It takes some telling." The marshal pulled in a deep breath. "Right after I got you locked up I found out it was Scalp done the stagecoach job, not you. Scalp done it and set out to frame you. You mind he overheard us the day we were talking in front of the jail, mentioning about Peaceful paid never going loaded, and about you needing the 2,000? Cunning as an animal, Scalp was. He left the gold for you on the porch just the way you told me. He done that to head suspicion your way when you paid up at the bank. Then he left the money bag with the siftings of yellow fork gold in it where it would be found in your tool shed. That was to clinch you to the crime and..." "Which it sure did," Larry finished. "But right after I got you locked up I found out my mistake." The marshal raised a groping hand to his blood-matted hair. "I found out Scalp Jackson was the one, and I called him on it. He was too quick for me. Let me have it alongside my head and left me for dead on the floor of my own house. But I'm pretty tough. I came around and I got here just in time for the fireworks." Larry nodded excitedly. "That explains why Scalp Jackson took up a stand in front of the jail and made a pass at protecting me. He was figuring afterward to get credit for it, and forever throw off any suspicion from himself. Figured likely that someone would shoot me anyhow through the window. Instead of which," an abashed rancher put in, "we dabbed a loop on the jail bars and yanked out half the wall. The town'll have to buy me a new jail," the marshal threatened. He stood up and started rummaging through his clothes. "Who's got a chaw of tobacco?" "You got one in your hand," someone pointed out. "Can't eat that one. I'm sentimental about it." "What's special about it? Looks like an ordinary plug to me." "It is, excepting for the way it's bit off on one side. Ragged, shredded, as though whoever had been working on it had to kind of saw it off between teeth that didn't come together much." "Peaceful Paul?" "Correct. When I went through Peaceful's clothes and didn't find no plug, I wondered about it. I kept looking. Then I found this one in the box where Scalp Jackson kept his truck. He was like a squirrel for storing away odds and ends of stuff. He had the butts on half a dozen plugs. But only this one was ragged the way Peaceful Paul's always was. I figured that after Scalp had made his kill he seen the plug, maybe in Peaceful's hand, and he figured why should he leave good tobacco go to waste. So he just took it. It made enough of a clue for me to start putting things together and call him on it. The rest you know. Lord knows where we'll ever find." A chuckle broke out somewhere in the crowd. It caught on, rippling into a general laugh that blew off a lot of pent-up tension in a hurry. Before the marshal knew what was happening, he found himself being borne along in a mob rush. Around the corner of the jail the mob spread away on all sides after depositing the marshal forcibly on top of the crumbled adobe which had been torn from the wall at the same time the bars had been yanked out. Nobody had to say anything. The lawmen could see, the same thing the others had seen when the jail wall had let go. The thing which had stunned them into speechless inactivity and given Larry his chance to make a break. Gold. The sun had shone on it as the yellow metal, in coin and nuggets, had splashed from the crashing wall. Gold. The sun still shone on it, sending yellow, exciting glints from cracks and crevasses of the broken adobe. "Well, shoo my dogs." The marshal gasped. "Gold in the jailhouse wall. See how it was? Living by himself in there, old Scalp had plenty of chance to hollow him out a hole in the dirt wall where he could hide the gold. And it wasn't a bad stunt. Who'd ever think of looking in the jail for stolen gold?" "I reckon," Larry Wander's voice sounded weary, "this closes the case complete, except for the $2,000 of their own money that I paid over to the bank this morning." The marshal regarded him severely. "Leave me give you some advice, young fella, forget it. The whole town owes you something for its mistake about you. And I, personally, owe you my life. We'll talk to them at the bank. We'll figure out something. Trouble with you, Larry, you worry too much." The end.